So in this talk, Resilience Revisited, character, skills, competencies and more, most of what I'm going to say will also be reproduced on the slides. That's a purposeful decision of mine because obviously a lot of people in this room don't have English as a first language, so they might want to actually see the content on the slide as well as verbally. So a brief history of resilience. This really is a very brief history. Now, obviously, I'm going back to the kind of recent past here. And the topic of resilience predated the launch of positive psychology and its application in positive education. So many people in this room will have heard of the Penn Resilience Program. Put your hand up if you've heard of the PRP or Penn Resilience Program. So a few people have heard of that. And that began in 1990. Since then, it's evolved and it's still going strong. I checked last week and you can still request a PRP workshop through the Positive Psychology Centre website. Now, generally speaking, positive psychology is kind of dated to around 1998, which is when Martin Seligman became president of the APA, the American Psychology Association, and launched positive psychology as one of the initiatives. So the PRP predates that. And James mentioned grit earlier on, and I'm also going to talk about mindset, which was referenced in Andreas Schleicher's talk as well. We've also got Paul Tuff's book, How Children Succeed. So I think it's safe to say that PRP and other kind of resilience programs are still prevalent in today's classrooms in the US, in the UK and in Europe as well. Now, in the previous session, people were saying, what's resilience for? What's the end of resilience? And in most cases, within this resilience orthodoxy, as you might want to call it, in these programs, it's about building individual resilience for success, perhaps academic success, in, of course, school context, sporting success, business success. But there's also a salutary aspect as well, that resilience will hopefully prevent depression, although more on that in a moment, and anxiety as well. So that's a very brief history of resilience. Now, I'm not going to go into a range of definitions here, that would take too long, and I want to get cracking with the main thrust of what I think character educators should be learning about resilience. But what I will say, of course, is that the word derives really from the natural world, about how organisms adapt to and withstand disruption to their habitat. This has been used in other domains as well, such as physics, to refer to the ability of a substance or system to return to its previous state after some kind of disturbance or displacement. Now, these ideas of bouncing back, which is an expression I think we heard in the panel session and from Michael as well just now, overcoming challenges and adapting to change characterise many current psychological definitions that have been applied in educational domains. And if you're interested in that, I would encourage you to have a look at those definitions yourself. But for the moment, bouncing back, overcoming challenge, adapting to change, that's what we're talking about. Now, the Penn Resilience Program, for people who don't know, is an 18-lesson curriculum which was initially aimed at 11 to 13-year-olds, although actually Martin Seligman rolled out, somewhat unsuccessfully by all accounts, the comprehensive soldier fitness program that was kind of based on some of the key principles of the PRP, and that was in 2008. Now, the Penn Resilience Program is delivered by teachers and counsellors and helps young adolescents identify and make changes to their explanatory style. Now, I'm going to enlarge on what an explanatory style is in a moment, but for now, it's a kind of a mindset. So the PRP consists of disputing automatic thoughts, this is negative beliefs that young people might have, and examining the evidence for those beliefs, and also enhancing problem-solving skills as well. So this is what the PRP consists of. So this is largely a cognitive approach in terms of the disputation of automatic thoughts. The goal of the PRP is to cultivate salutary styles of thinking that challenge habitual dysfunctional patterns that people might have developed, and this allows people to develop an optimistic explanatory style as opposed to a pessimistic one. And it's also known as learned optimism, which is the title of Martin Seligman's book from 2006, originally published in 1990, Learned Optimism. So the goal here is to promote resilience with the aim of preventing anxiety and depression. Now, this was referenced earlier, I think, in Andreas Schleicher's talk, but we inhabit a world in which at least 1 in 5 adults reports a common mental health disorder, and a substantial number of children and young people as well. So it is meeting a need. In the UK, there was a version of the PRP called the UK Resilience Program, UKRP, and there was a report published by the Department for Education in 2011, which was about the use of the UKRP and an evaluation of it. So this has gone quite broadly into a kind of policy area of influence. Now, I said I was going to explain what explanatory styles are. The idea is that when you make an attribution, for example, for a failure that you've encountered, you locate the cause of that either internally to yourself or externally. You think that perhaps this will always happen, or you think it's just a temporary blip. You think that whatever you do goes the same way, that's the pervasiveness of it, or you tend to think, well, actually, no, this hasn't worked out in this domain, but in other domains of my life, I'm doing well. Now, the idea is that you can effectively move from attributing things internally, it's my fault, you can exercise some agency and choice over whether you see that as something that will always be the case, a permanence dimension, and you can also exert some kind of self-criticism if you start thinking to yourself, well, everything I ever do goes wrong, and that's the kind of pervasiveness. So, for example, if you fail an exam, if you have the pessimistic explanatory style, you might say, I am a failure. If you have the optimistic explanatory style, you protect yourself somewhat by saying, well, those were really hard questions, so the locus is external. You think, well, I'm a failure, I always will be, as opposed to, well, you know, I didn't do it this time, I'll just have to do better next time. And then this idea that everything you do ends in failure, bleeding across all domains of your life, as opposed to reminding yourself that you are successful in other domains of your life. So the thinking behind this is that we can exercise some control over the attributions that we make, and we can teach young people to be more resilient by inculcating this optimistic explanatory style. So that's the key idea. Now, when the PRP was evaluated, there have been a few different evaluations, but its effects have been quite modest, actually. So Jane Gillam, who was one of the co-creators of the PRP, undertook a meta-analysis of 17 implementations of the course and concluded that it did have an effect in reducing depressive symptoms in the young people, but this was small. Also, there were similar findings reported in Australian meta-analyses of the PRP as well. So there is something of a question mark about how effective the PRP is. There's a whole lot more that I could go into, but for the purposes of this talk, I think that brief review will suffice. So now we're going on to growth mindset, which Andreas Schleicher mentioned in his talk. Again, this is another kind of idea about having a mindset that can be changed, and the view that learners' beliefs about their abilities impact learning, motivation, and achievement. So in a growth mindset, individuals believe that their abilities can be developed through dedication and hard work, rather than being fixed and innate. And again, there's this sort of idea, a reaction to failure, that people with the fixed mindset, whether they're actually of high intelligence or not, is associated with the fear of failure. Perhaps if you always do brilliantly, you're afraid that you'll blot your copybook somehow and you'll make a mistake, so it makes you afraid of failure. Whereas in the growth mindset, failure provides the opportunity to learn, and that's seen as a good thing, challenge, and of course that makes people more resilient as well. Now, as I say, I think there are echoes here of the PRP in the sense that we're looking at kind of a mindset or an explanatory style. So there's a typology of being one way or another, fixed or growth, pessimistic or optimistic explanatory style. So these are sort of the two views of fixed and growth mindset. So I'll just let you read those for yourselves.
Right.
The key thing to take away is this idea of failure being the limit of my abilities, or failures offering an opportunity for growth. Now, despite what Andreas was sharing earlier on, there have been some serious replication issues with growth mindset as well. And that's described by Lee and Bates in 2019. So Timothy Bates, who's based in Edinburgh, and his team have shown that the growth mindset has little and perhaps even a negative effect on attainment. So there is some question here about just how effective it actually is in promoting attainment. Adopting a growth mindset is widely believed to greatly improve educational outcomes, but our findings suggest otherwise. We didn't see the remarkable results promised in earlier studies and would caution against using this approach in class. Beliefs about basic ability appear unrelated to resilience or progress in school. Now, in response to detractors, Carol Dweck came back and said perhaps the right experimental conditions hadn't been created, that there was something wrong with the way that the experiments had been done. But as Toby Young said in an opinion piece that appeared in The Spectator, if professors of psychology can't repeat the results, what hope do teachers surrounded by unruly children have? So there is a question there of just how fine-tuned the environment's got to be if you want to see this effect. Okay, so going from an I can't to an I can. Now, what these things have in common, of course, what I'm talking about is metacognition, thinking about thinking. And I think that there may be benefits to introducing young people to the basics of metacognition, thinking about thinking when they're very young, so that we can challenge habitual ways of thinking before they become entrenched. I think it's pretty much clear to all of us that how we explain the causes of our setbacks plays a key part in how we respond to events going forward. And I think that those 3 Ps that I mentioned earlier that characterise the explanatory styles can be challenged even from a young age. So you can challenge the idea of permanence. You could do this yourselves with young people in your life. If you hear them catastrophising that things will always go wrong, you can challenge the permanence dimension. If they're saying everything goes wrong, you can challenge the pervasiveness. And if they're saying it's all their fault, obviously I don't want to discourage people taking responsibility, but you can look at the bigger picture and what else might have influenced people. So I think there's something to be said for metacognition. Just before I move on to the next part of this talk, I will mention Angela Duckworth's grit, which James mentioned in passing earlier on. This is the idea that the secret to outstanding achievement for students, athletes or business people isn't talent, but this blend of passion and persistence that she calls grit. And again, this found its way into policy circles with the US Department of Education report in 2013. So this is obviously gone far as well. Now, what I want to say about PRP, the Penn Resilience Program, growth mindset and grit, are that they are, in the words of Bruce Daisley, driven by a common central notion that the way we frame challenges is critical to achieving greater mental toughness, and that the framing strategy can be taught. So my question now is, how critical is it? How critical is the way we frame challenges to achieving greater mental toughness? And with that, I go on to some broader critique of resilience training programs of the sort I've just described. So, for example, one of the big criticisms that didn't come up in the panel discussion is that resilience locates the problem in the individual. The going's got tough, as Billy Ocean said, but you haven't got going. And the problem with this is that it promotes an unstable environment in which the onus is on the individual to adapt. Critics contend that this kind of resilience training teaches people, whatever age they are, how to keep on adapting and perhaps not change things for the better. So some of this critique comes from people who want to place this in the bigger socio-economic perspective. So Evans and Reid, in this paper from 2013, talk about this idea of resilience. The resilient subject is a subject which must permanently struggle to accommodate itself to the world, and not a subject which can conceive of changing the world, its structure, and its conditions of possibility. They even describe it as a reactionary impulse aimed at increasing the capacities of the subject to adapt to its dangers and simply reduce the degree to which it suffers. So this is tacked up somewhere in Louisiana. I'm afraid I don't know where, but this is obviously not academics, not people with a kind of a critical background, exemplifying exactly what Evans and Reid just described. Stop calling me resilient. Every time you say, oh, they're resilient, that means you can do something else to me. I'm not resilient. So it's not just Evans and Reid, also Slater talks about how these resilience programs sit a bit light, potentially, to socio-economic realities. He even calls them terms of endurance in neoliberal education that depoliticise educational problems and serve to normalise social inequality and educational insecurity. He obviously is pointing out that this abstraction of resilience and grit from material conditions ultimately lands the individual with the bill for their failure of character and determination, as you can see from that quote there. Now, here we are. Some people would argue that we're in the birthplace of psychology in Vienna. Some people might not, but obviously just take it for the moment that we are, right? So you're probably all familiar with this optical illusion. What do you see? Okay, so we've got, it's called Rubin's vase. We've got either the black vase or we've got the white two faces, a perceptual problem, which I'm going to use as a metaphor for different models of resilience. So, psychological models of resilience that I've just been talking about foreground the figure, that's the vase, the individual. Critics see the ground, people like Evans and Reid and Slater that I was just talking about. Now, of course, when you fix your attention on either the vase or the faces, you can't see both at the same time. So that's what we want to avoid doing, fixing our attention on either or. Because obviously resilience advocates want to emphasise the control that we have over circumstances, learning optimism, developing grit or a growth mindset, whereas detractors see this as distracting us from material social realities. Clearly both sides are contributing some understanding here, and both are inherently reductionistic. Only a reductionist would go for either the thesis or the antithesis. So I think you can tell where I'm going next with the synthesis. Now this is something that we just talked about. In fact, Andreas Schleicher talked about it just now. It's a lesson I learned in my PhD, And it's that courage and hope isn't a capacity of individuals. It's not a skill, it's not a competence. In facing all kinds of situations, courage can be collective. And we know this because the word encouragement tells us that courage comes from the people around us, etymologically. And other people help to build courage in us. And this is what Andreas Steicher was saying about how teachers are, help us to believe in ourselves even more. Now, the fact of the matter is, most of us in this room are educators, and we already know this. We know that our encouragement is a really crucial aspect of competence building in young people. So we already know this. But my question is, why do schools persist with the PRP, grit and growth mindset interventions, which foreground building individual capacity, and they don't take as much notice of this kind of collective dimension, which we all know to be the case, and which Andreas was talking about as well. I think Veronica alluded to it in the panel discussion as well, about how this courage is collective, or resilience is collective. Now, I always associate Austria with resilience. The reason for that is that the first time I spoke here, at Roland's invitation, it was about resilience. And then last year, when I was in Innsbruck at the European Positive Psychology Conference, I met this guy, Michael Ungar. And of course, now I'm talking about resilience again at Roland's invitation. So Austrian resilience are very much tied in my mind. But what Michael Ungar, who's a Canadian sociologist, advocates is the social aspect of resilience. So so-called resilient people have larger social networks, and individuals with adequate resources show more resilience than so-called rugged individuals do, the individual that was foregrounded in the metaphor of the vase.
Right.
And so what Ungar advocated at Innsbruck last year was a biopsychosocial ecological system, which is a bit of a mouthful, but I absolutely agree with this. So he takes the kind of Bronfenbrenner style approach here, looking at the systems that the individual has, biological, then psychological, and then the social environmental, the built environment, and the natural environment, and sees resilience as intersecting all of these areas. And this speaks to a question that was asked before the break about development and parents, and what role do they have? Because obviously, at a very young age, some of these systems are going to be more influential than the outer ones, as obviously a child develops. So this is not just biopsychosocial, it's developmental as well. So across the lifespan, multiple factors are protective at different levels, with different enablers, from caregivers, speaking to the point about caregivers earlier on, to neighbourhoods prioritised as people mature, and Ungar calls this differential impact. So the take-home message really from this section is that resilience studies focused on mental health neglect the external enablers, particularly those at the community level. And so we're looking at the psychological systems, but not the social environment, the built environment, etc., that influence an individual's resilience. Ungar says that resilience depends just as much on the culturally relevant resources available to stressed individuals in their social, built and natural environments as it does on individual thoughts, feelings and behaviours. So he's not denying there that the thoughts, feelings and behaviours are a part of the picture. But what he does say a bit later on in that paper is that regulatory and cognitive capacities of the sort that are foregrounded in the resilience programmes are unsustainable unless other co-occurring social and physical systems, such as family, housing and natural environment, are robust enough to support new regimens of adaptive behaviour. So we've got, as I say, the synthesis here of the figure and the ground, the individual and the social context. And these factors were noted to be protective in a cross-cultural study that Ungar undertook in 2007. Relationships, a powerful identity, power and control, so yes, there is that element of control. Social justice, access to material resources, a sense of cohesion, belonging and spirituality, some people might want to separate those, and cultural adherence as well. Now, I mentioned this book by Bruce Daisley, which incidentally I read on the way to Austria, so again, even more of that kind of resilience association with Austria. He put forward what he calls a social identity explanation of resilience. And he identifies three components: control, that sense of personal control that I was just talking about in the models that we've covered, the PRP, the grit, and obviously also the growth mindset. Identity, he says a strong sense of identity allows people to cope with situations others might find intimidating, although I question whether that's really about identity or whether that's about purpose. And then, of course, this community idea as well. Interesting here that among college students, individuals are less likely to be negative about themselves in direct proportion to the number of groups to which they regard themselves as belonging. That's based on an empirical study. But what's very interesting actually about that book, I thought it was brilliant. It was before I'd heard Michael Ungar speak, and he doesn't mention Ungar's work at all. He just talks about the role of community, whereas I think it's a bit of an omission to not include Ungar's theory, as I was talking about. So in the last part of this talk, as I say, I don't think we're going to have time for questions because of starting late, but how does this apply in character education? So I think this synthesis of figure and ground, the internal and the external acids, is changing the way that social scientists like Michael Ungar think about resilience. But I profess that it's time that character educators gave up on foregrounding resilience, grit and growth mindset programs, which are at best a part of the picture. And I think instead we should be acknowledging that resilience is a multi-systemic process. And we'll miss this for as long as we focus on resilience as a trait of rugged individuals. So what I suggest is that we start to build the external assets into the models that we have of resilience in character education, and we build those into the programs and interventions that we roll out. We could keep the idea that metacognition is important. We can keep that. But I think what we need to add is this idea of building social support, building community, and our emphasis in character education could be on that. So if we were to reimagine resilience in character education, I would say that metacognition is part of the picture, but we can also encourage young people to build positive connections with family, friends, and other supportive adults. And this is building on, I say, what Andreas Schleicher was talking about with the teachers earlier on, being such a nexus of support for young people. We need to work on building a sense of community inside schools where we work, universities where we work, whatever organisations we're in. And the other thing I think is really important, but I would say this, wouldn't I, because I'm in character education, is that we should develop other strengths of character alongside resilience. It's not, and it never was, a magic bullet. And so what are the other character strengths we could build alongside resilience? Again, one of those strengths is gratitude, but I would say that, wouldn't I, because I'm a gratitude researcher. But of course, what we know about gratitude is that it helps to build social bonds. So if we build a sense of gratitude in young people, that actually will help with the social connection that supports resilience that I've been talking about. We also need to build compassion to temper resilience. We don't want it all to be this Marlborough man kind of rugged, dealing with things stoically. It's important that we build compassion and possibly self-compassion as well for when we don't cope with things perhaps as well as we want to. So gratitude is a candidate, compassion is a candidate, and the other one is awe. I think this got mentioned, awe and wonder, and obviously Michael talked about that as well. My other talk here tomorrow is going to be on the transformative power of awe for character education. And one of the things that relevance in terms of resilience is that awe has been found to help people with post-traumatic stress disorder. So obviously that's an extreme scenario, but if the experience of awe helps people to handle and to deal with that situation, then perhaps we should be introducing more awe into character education as well. So this is what my suggestion for how we broaden out resilience in character education. So, as I mentioned, Daisley advocates this social identity explanation of resilience, and he identifies this by what he calls a synonymous term, fortitude. Now, I disagree that resilience and fortitude are synonymous, because I think that the resilience that's foregrounded in those resilience programs that I've been talking about has narrower, more instrumentalist goals. And this goes back to what Blaine was saying about instrumentalism, about what people are being resilient for. Whereas fortitude, I think, has broader ends, broader telloi. Now, I agree with Daisley that the kind of resilience promoted in resilience programs perhaps should have had its day, although I would allow a proportion of it. But I think it's doubtful we could win back some of the critics, some of those people I was mentioning, like Evans and Reid or Slater, using the same terms of engagement. So that's another reason why I think we might want to talk about fortitude in a more broad sense rather than resilience, and looking at how fortitude is cultivated in communion, just like all the other virtues, pretty much. So resilience, as I say, has become pretty heavily freighted with these negative associations. I think it needs to be expanded to encompass broader ends than individual success, achievement, even the salutary benefits. This idea of individual resilience is actually an illusion. The virtue of courage is collectively sustained in communion with others. I think if we shift our emphasis at the same time as we broaden out our interest in what resilience is, if we shift it to fortitude, this might help us to promote that strength in a more philosophically informed way. As a virtue of character that is to be cultivated for its intrinsic value to the end of a flourishing life and in building up the common good. So thank you very much.